On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong would step foot onto the moon. This moment would echo through history as humanity's greatest moment. Everyone knows the name Armstrong, but few know the name of the man who got him there, and that he was an American, and the path to the stars was paved by the Nazis. Hi, I'm Crate13, and over the weekend I broke my mask, so for 1,000 subscribers, you now get to see more of my forehead. Today we're diving into the life of Wernher von Braun, a man whose life is a roller coaster of moral extremes. But, more importantly, how some of his darkest moments led directly to some of humanity's brightest futures. Our story begins in a small Prussian village in 1912. Wernher would be born to a very well-off family, as his father was the Minister of Agriculture for the German Empire. It was here, as a young child of 3 years old, his mother would gift him a telescope for his confirmation. And this gift would change the world, as von Braun's eyes were now fixated towards the stars. Before he was old enough to worry about going to space, the young von Braun actually had a very big talent for piano. As a child, he was able to play from memory Bach and Beethoven, just showing off his natural intelligence. But later in life, his love for space wouldn't seem so far off with advancements in rocket technology. Von Braun would always be up on the news about them. At one point as a teenager, he was actually arrested for making a makeshift rocket and igniting it in a crowded street. By 1932, Wernher had graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering, but he realized if he was going to achieve his dream of spaceflight, he needed more. So, he earned his doctorate in physics in 2 years, as one does. Importantly, while he was a student getting his physics degree, he met Auguste Piccard, a pioneer in balloon travel, and they were able to speak briefly about the possibilities of space travel to the moon. Von Braun would claim that this exact discussion was instrumental in forming his resolve to finish his mission and get someone on the moon. And with this newfound resolve, he would get a job working for the German military. But Crate, the German military was heavily neutered and could not have any offensive weapons following the Treaty of Versailles, I hear you saying, hypothetical viewer. Well, yes, you're not wrong. But the Treaty of Versailles left out a ban on rocket weapons because, one, the writers of it were kind of stupid, and two, people didn't realize the potential in their hands just yet. So, did von Braun do this for his want to make militarized weapons for the National Socialists? No, this was just the only career path optional for him at the time because space agencies weren't a thing yet. That's at least what he told the FBI after his surrender to the Allies, but that's for later. So, von Braun would work at and eventually become the technical director of the Peenemünde rocket facility. But by 1937, him just working at the plant wasn't good enough. He got a call asking him to officially join the Nazi Party. He knew if he declined, he would be purged of his position, and his dream of achieving interplanetary travel would never come true. So he officially joined the party. Then, 2 years later, Germany would invade Poland, and as we say, the rest is history. So, the government began to take an even deeper look at von Braun and his work at Peenemünde. And by 1940, Heinrich Himmler himself personally requested that von Braun join the morally infamous and fashionably famous SS. Now, this was different than just supporting your nation as a majority of the German military was doing during the war. No, this was the militarized armed wing of the Nazi Party. According to von Braun, he did not want to join, but again, he didn't want to lose his life's work, and also didn't want to be executed. Von Braun claimed he had only worn his SS uniform once in a meeting with Himmler for a photo op, but his co-workers said that he wore it all the time. To be fair, it was designed by Coco Chanel. But as the 40s trucked on, things weren't looking so good for Germany. So the big man with the tiny stash started to look for any kind of miracle weapon that could turn the tide of the war. Whether it be big tanks, tiny jets, or the Wunderwaffe from World at War. They were trying everything. But most of these wonder weapons were duds. I say most because this is where von Braun came to shine. By 1942, von Braun's life's work was now a weapon completing its first test flight. The V-2 rocket. The Fuhrer was absolutely giddy in his little lederhosen about the prospects of this weapon, and he showered Wernher von Braun with so many gifts and rewards for his accomplishment. By 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had long been lost, and he who shall not be named wanted vengeance on Britain, hence the V in V2. And they were being mass-produced by von Braun and his men. And not just his men, but also by forced labor. Yeah, this is the not fun part of the video. In the factories where these rockets were built, German political prisoners and other undesirables were forced to work in horrible conditions to build these rockets. And this is where we get conflicting reports about von Braun's involvement and knowledge of German war crimes. Because you see, this wasn't just forced labor. Prisoners were dying constantly, and there were many reports of beatings and prisoners being hung from their arms above ground for lagging behind on their work quotas. Fritz Todt was a German officer who was renowned for his cruelty, and he was on site at Peenemünde. Also, side note, I don't know if it's Peenemünde or Peenemünde. It's probably Peenemünde. That sounds more German as I say it. I don't know. I don't speak German. I'm sure I've pissed off some autistic man, and I'm sorry for that. Von Braun, after the war, claimed that he did know about the harsh treatments at the facility, but he never engaged in any mistreatment of the prisoners. And this is corroborated by his co-workers and by some of the prisoners that were on the base. But on the other hand, many guards and prisoners not only claimed that Von Braun was very aware, but an active participant in the crimes committed. And sometimes even beating the prisoners himself. So we really don't know what was happening while he was building the V-2 rocket. When questioned after the war why he didn't speak up and protest about the prisoners' mistreatment, he claimed that it would have done no good and they still would have been mistreated anyways. And one of his co-workers, when asked the same question, claimed that Von Braun would have been shot on the spot for protesting. But we do know this. More people died building the V-2 rocket than were actually killed by them, which was about 9,000 people. So I guess this weapon was a dud too. But back to the V-2 rocket itself. Where it lacked in being an effective weapon, it was a marvel of human engineering. In 1944, it became the first artificial object to pass the Kármán line and officially enter space. Over 3,200 were fired during the course of the war, with over half of those hitting London itself. Again, it wasn't effective as a traditional weapon, but it was pretty good as a scare tactic. Think about it. At the time, there's no way to stop this thing like you could a bomber. It's going to fly faster than anything you've ever seen and then crash into your grandma's house. And when Von Braun was questioned after the war about civilians being killed with his rockets, he did claim he was very upset and regretted that they died. However, he said it was wartime. And like Fritz Haber that I covered in a recent video, he believed that a scientist's duty is to his country's first. But despite all his good work, his luck would run out. Von Braun was overheard by his secretary complaining with some of his fellow scientists while they were drinking. He made the mistake of admitting that the war was likely lost at this point, that he wished the prisoners weren't treated so harshly, and that he wishes that this all didn't happen and that they could have just went to the moon instead. What was particularly bad about all this was his secretary was a SS spy, and she immediately turned them in to high command, who charged them for being communist sympathizers. Eventually, though, when basically everyone who knew Von Braun demanded his release, the Fuhrer actually gave in. They claimed that he was vital to the war effort, and he was released. Now, this was in mid-1944. And if you know anything about history, this is when Germany's downfall really sped up. With the D-Day landings being successful, Germany was now on the back foot on a two-front war, and the writing was on the wall. When the Soviets were 100 miles from Peenemünde, Von Braun and his fellow scientists would meet together and discuss who they should surrender to. They knew they would likely be spared by both sides due to their knowledge of rocketry, and that their weapon would forever change warfare for whoever got it. So this is where an important aspect of Von Braun's life came out. His faith. Wernher von Braun was a devout Christian, and when it came to deciding which country would get the ballistic missile, he chose the Americans, as he said himself. We wanted to see the world spared another conflict such as Germany had just been through, and we felt that only by surrendering such a weapon to people who were guided by the Bible could such an assurance to the world be best secured. So that's great, but the Americans were on the other side of the continent, and the Soviets were nipping at their heels, so they had to make a plan, and quick. By February of 1945, von Braun had managed to convince one of his higher-ups to get them transferred to central Germany. But as soon as they received that order, they received another order from the Fuhrer himself, commanding them to arm up and go fight the Soviets. Von Braun knew this meant suicide for his men and that their weapon would fall into the Soviets' hands. So he just pretended he didn't read it, and all of his friends just still went to Germany. Oh, what? I'm crazy. I must have got there as soon as we left. I'm so sorry. But here in central Germany, they were under 24/7 guard by the SS, who had explicit orders to execute all of the scientists if it seemed like they would fall into Allied hands. But thankfully, von Braun again was able to convince his captors to split up the prisoners amongst different locations. That way they couldn't be easily picked off by a bomber. And this worked until April 29th, when the Fuhrer in his bunker ordered that all technical men related to the rocketry program were to be executed. This was one of his final orders before he played Russian roulette with a single stack. Von Braun managed to catch wind of this and stole a train and loaded up 500 of his colleagues on it and steamed west towards the American lines in Austria. He would surrender and would be immediately scooped up by the FBI, who would interrogate him for days. After lengthy background checks, they determined that von Braun was telling the truth about and that he was just a scientist who joined out of necessity. Basically, he was just following orders. Von Braun would later write in a memoir about the years leading up to and during the war in Germany. And he initially was writing fondly about the party. He talked about how he got caught up in the patriotism of the moment and how life did actually get better compared to that of Weimar Germany. At least for a little while. But in his writings, he is consistently critical of Mustache Man, claiming that he was a godless man who saw himself as a god. So after dodging kidnapping by Soviet agents, the OSS, or the precursor to the CIA, organized Operation Paperclip. You see, von Braun was just one of thousands of German scientists that the US had scrambled to pick up by war's end. They knew likely the next big war would be against their former allies, the Soviets. And they needed experience from people who had just got done fighting them, and the German engineering to do it. Fun fact, the first General Secretary of NATO was actually a former Nazi general. The only reason he got that job was because he was the only candidate with the job experience of 3 to 4 years required. Second fun fact, during von Braun's interrogations, one British man was in the room taking notes. Later in life, he would use these exact notes that he took to go on to invent the Concorde airplane engine. But back to Operation Paperclip. Von Braun and the rest of the surviving Peenemünde team were transferred to Fort Bliss, Texas, which is just north of El Paso in the middle of the desert. It was here he would not have a good time. He would continue his research, but it was under a lot of scrutiny and very little funding. This man with genius-level IQ, who had a PhD in physics and had invented the first ballistic missile, had to report to a 26-year-old kid who had a mechanical engineer degree. So, I get why he was annoyed. He and his friends would jokingly refer to themselves as POPs, or prisoners of peace. Which, sure, that's funny, but it's better than being in a gulag. But all of his requests to work on rockets related to space travel, like in Germany, were denied. And that's how this continued for the next 5 years until 1950 with the breakout of the Korean War. Because von Braun would be transferred to my backyard, Huntsville, Alabama. Yes, for those that don't know, Huntsville is not just home to the Trash Pandas minor league baseball team, they're also home to one of the most dangerous and well-kept secret research facilities in possibly the world. Redstone Arsenal is where countless amounts of US weaponry, including nuclear missiles, was and is developed to this day. So yeah, if nuclear war ever does pop off, North Alabama will be one of the most radioactive places on Earth because it will become glass. And that's all thanks to von Braun's work there. Von Braun would end up living in Huntsville for 20 years. And it's here the United States space industry was born. You see, Wernher was making missiles when finally he was allowed to make a modified version. Not for delivering a nuclear payload to Moscow, but for delivering a satellite to orbit. This rocket would become Juno 1, and it would launch America's first satellite, Explorer 1, into orbit on the last day of January 1958. And since America has free speech, von Braun could finally advocate publicly for space travel without fear of being fired and shot. So he would do an interview with the Huntsville Times where he claimed rocket flight to the moon would be possible, and this served as one of the main driving points for public support for the space race. Von Braun would go on a public tour across the country as his military restrictions eased up and would go around advocating for space travel. He would even make drawings of space stations that would go on to be the direct inspiration for those seen in 2001: A Space Odyssey. And he even got to work with Walt Disney himself. He did this to make 3 televised miniseries explaining how colonization of the moon was not only possible, but also Mars. His goal was to tell humanity how bright the future would be as we entered the space age. You know how the 50s had this really hopeful outlook of the future that's like the exact opposite of ours now? How everything looked like the Jetsons? Von Braun helped start that. And with the stroke of a pen in 1958, NASA was created, and von Braun was made its first director. He would push the agency forward in its fight against the Soviet Union, while at the same time prioritizing human life. Unlike the Soviet Union. Many were mad at him for delaying what would have been the first man in space being launched from a rocket, but he delayed it due to weather conditions not being absolutely perfect, because he wasn't willing to take the risk that that man would die. And due to this delay, Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space, giving the Russians this win, with the Americans following up 3 weeks later with Alan Shepard. And eventually on July 16, 1969, the Saturn V rocket would launch from Florida, carrying a crew of 3 men all the way to the moon, where we would win the space race. Allegedly, according to my mother. After achieving this milestone that quite literally no one has ever or has since achieved, von Braun quietly retired from NASA in 1972. This was likely due to the public support for anything related to space plummeting after we got someone on the moon, which must have been incredibly depressing to him because he said that we should have the technology by the 1980s needed in order to get to Mars. From here, he would go on to found the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, which I've been to many times on field trips, and it's a cool place if you get a chance to go. He would also do a lot of philanthropic work in India, setting up satellite TV stations for educational programs for the poorest in that nation. And later, he would come up with the idea of space camp for kids, so that was cool. He would relocate to Washington, D.C., and it was here he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. He would spend his remaining years helping where he could in anything related to space. In 1975, he was awarded the National Medal for Science, but he couldn't attend the ceremony at the White House due to his failing health. Wernher von Braun would pass away on June 16, 1977 at the age of 65. His wife would go on to live until 2025. Like, she passed away barely a year ago, which that's just a crazy timeline thing for me. He's buried in Virginia at a very modest grave that only reads his name and a Bible verse, Psalms 19:1, which says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork." Well guys, that's now my second video on a morally complex German scientist who made horrible weapons of war during a world war, but also contributed to a major milestone to human development. If you enjoyed this one, you should absolutely go check that one out too. I hope that you enjoy whatever food you decided to eat or whatever poop you decided to poop when you sat down to watch this video. I'm Crate13, and I hope you have a blessed day.